So we didn't talk much about Jimmy Page's influences yet. He was influenced by the young rockabilly, young rock and roll players of the day, much like Jeff Beck was. Scotty Moore, James Burton, who were both Elvis's guitar players. Those were, really good players and very influential on those British kids at that time. Cliff Gallup, also from Gene Vincent to the Blue Caps, that was Jeff Beck's big hero. But Jimmy Page loved that too. Chuck Berry, they all loved Chuck Berry. Everybody got something from Chuck Berry in those days. Bo Diddley, obviously the blues man Bo Diddley, and other bluesmen like B.B. King and general blues music. But where Jimmy Page was really different from his peers, where a lot of people were listening, like you could say, okay, yes, Pete Townsend was listening to those guys too. Keith Richards was listening to those guys too. Jeff Beck was listening to those guys too. But Jimmy was also listening to Eastern music, and he was listening to Indian music, and he was listening to Celtic music and country music. And that was really the differentiator in his influences and where he would learn to bring that acoustic side into the band. And one of the guys that doesn't get mentioned very much when you're talking about acoustic players is a guy named Bert Jansch. He's a Scottish folk player, brilliant acoustic player. His albums are really good. It's very strange. Bert Jansch, Jansch.
Okay.
Yeah, and here we have a guy who was also very influential on Jimmy Page, and here we have also the first signs of plagiarism. The downside of Jimmy Page and Led Zeppelin, in some cases, is they were, unlike, for example, the Rolling Stones, where the Rolling Stones would be, happy to play someone's song, but they'd credit the blues man for it. If they're going to play the song, they're going to not claim they wrote it. Jimmy's idea was, let's claim we wrote it. Let's take, let them chase us for the money. And later on, people did chase them for the money, and they had to settle out of court and stuff like that. But, they say behind every great fortune is a crime. And
that's a good saying.
Yeah, but it's largely true, and a lot of the people who were like the early industrial pioneers, like your Carnegies and guys like that, and Vanderbilts, and all of these people who became the top 1% of 1% of their own time. There are, at the bottom of those fortunes, there's a crime usually. Somebody stole something from somebody.
Yeah, there's also lots of stories around like the whole 90s computer era with Microsoft and Apple and Google and stuff.
Oh, absolutely. Xerox had the first point and click operating system, and I think it got stolen by either the Apple guys or the Windows guys. I can't remember which one, but they stole it, and they got there first after having stole it, and Xerox remained a copy machine. So you have these kinds of things. And let's be honest, if you look at the credits on the back of Led Zeppelin 1, you don't see, at least at the time, you see Zeppelin taking credit for songs that were Willie Dixon songs. I can't remember if he claims he stole Babe, I'm Gonna Leave You, or if he credited Joan Baez. But if you Google Led Zeppelin and plagiarism, you're going to get an interesting education. And one of the things that he stole was a song that he called Black Mountainside, I believe. And if you hear Bert Jansch, he's played, basically Jimmy Page stole this thing note for note and put it on Zeppelin 1 and didn't credit Bert Jansch. And we can play a clip of both, and you can see what I'm talking about. So the plagiarism starts on Led Zeppelin 1, and they've been fighting these battles. They just this year finally put to bed an accusation that Stairway to Heaven was ripped off from a band called Spirit.
And it was like some medieval progression or something originally.
Right. And my feeling on this whole thing with this is like, okay, it worked out well for you because you made a fortune off of this by stealing these songs and claiming they were yours, but you didn't have to do that necessarily. why not credit the artist? I mean, yes, obviously you line your pockets, right? But like I said, the Stones don't do that. The Stones will always credit, and that's why the bluesmen who were still alive when the Stones were at their height, the guys like Muddy Waters and Howlin' Wolf and B.B. King, and all of these guys really respected the Rolling Stones because they did their music authentically and they credited them for it. So they would get their royalties, where Zeppelin plagiarized it and they avoided paying those guys their royalties.
Is that mostly Jimmy Page's doing, or?
Now, the interesting thing about it is Jimmy says this is all because Robert Plant would sing these vocals over top of what he came up with, right? He would use their lyrics. And the one thing you can copyright in music is the song progression and the lyrics, right? You can copyright the melody and you can copyright the lyrics. Everything else is sort of like fair game, right? So how many 3-chord songs are the same 3-chord song? But if the lyrics are different, sometimes you get away with that. Sometimes you don't. George Harrison got burned on that with My Sweet Lord. Remember? He was accused of plagiarizing She's So Fine. And he lost that. Courts decided he had lifted it. And, he owed them some money. But what happened with Zeppelin was they decided they were going to just do it and see what happened. And by the time anyone chased them for money, they'd deal with it then. So it took a long time for people like Willie Dixon to get their money back on those tracks. And I think in later years, as part of the lawsuit, they may have had to credit them on new versions of reissues of these albums. By the time they lost the lawsuit, they're still pressing copies of Zeppelin 1, right? To this day, they're still pressing copies of it, and it may be credited on there now. And Jimmy's argument was like, I played a song, I played this riff, it becomes a blues riff, and it doesn't sound anything really like the original. But then Robert Plant starts putting a vocal on it that's using the lyrics from some other song he's heard, and that gets them in trouble plagiarism-wise. I think that argument goes so far. I think Jimmy's as guilty as anybody. The Burt Jansch thing alone, that's an instrumental, okay? He just lifted that. That has nothing to do with Robert Plant. So Jimmy's never been one to really take any responsibility for his shit, and that's one of his weaknesses. We've talked something about his strengths already, but some of his weaknesses has to do with things like owning up to his own bullshit. And he's never been able to do that. He's an incredibly egomaniac character who has, he just never wants to be associated with anything that casts him in a bad light. And nobody does, but I mean, when you do things that cast you in a bad light, at a certain point, maybe 40 years later, own up to your shit. And, I don't know, he has nothing to lose at this point in terms of stature. If he had actually come out and said, yeah, I did this stuff, I'm not proud of it, I think that would be fine. I don't think it would destroy his reputation or anything, but I don't think his ego can handle it. And this is one of the things that I'm not, as much as I love Jimmy Page, I don't love this aspect of Jimmy Page at all. And my feeling is if you're going to use someone else's stuff, credit it. And don't rip off other musicians if you can help it. Not this way. I mean, we all borrow from other people, but if you're going to actually play something that was somebody else's composition and you then take credit for it, and then you make a fortune by taking credit for it, I understand why everybody wanted to sue them. Now, they got lucky in the Stairway to Heaven case because, in fact, that one didn't hold as much water. There is some similarity to the track that the guys in Spirit played in the intro and everything, but it's a common chord progression. And the Zeppelin lawyers were able to come in and say, look, this progression has been around for thousands of years. It's a common thing. You can't say, you wrote this. They came in and they showed examples that predated Spirit of this progression in music. So first they won it, and then the Spirit appealed it. Then they won it again, and I think they went to another appeal. And on the third time, they finally conclusively won that they didn't rip off Stairway to Heaven. And I think in that case, it's true. I don't think they did. But had Jimmy Page heard that track and maybe subconsciously had that thing stuck in his mind, or was it just something that he tripped over himself as a common progression that a musician might trip over? We'll never know, and he's never going to admit it either way. But some of the blues stuff and this Burt Jansch track and things like that, that's hard to get away from that it was plagiarism.